When my son told me to sit down, I already knew something was wrong. He didn't look at my face. He kept staring at the table, at his hands, at everything except me. And in that moment, my heart felt heavy in a way I had never felt before. I smiled anyway, because mothers learn early in life how to smile when they are scared. Amy, he said softly, we need to talk. That sentence changed everything. That house had been my whole life, not just walls and a roof, but memories, breath, time. I moved into that house when I was a young bride. I still remembered the smell of fresh paint, the sound of my bangles echoing as I walked through empty rooms. Back then, we had nothing. And no furniture, no curtains, just hope. My husband and I built that home slowly, brick by brick, year by year. Every crack in the wall had a story. Every corner had heard laughter, arguments, prayers, and tears. That house raised my children. It held their first cries, their first steps, their school bags leaning against the wall, and later, it held my loneliness when everyone grew up and moved on. When my husband passed away, the house became quiet, too quiet. I would wake up at night, thinking I heard his footsteps. Then I would remember. Grief teaches you strange habits. I stayed strong for my children. I always did. I told them, I am fine, even when I wasn't, because mothers don't want to become a burden. My youngest son was always close to me, or so I thought. He was gentle as a child, always holding my hand, always calling me when he was away. When he married, I welcomed his wife with an open heart. I told her, this is your home. I meant it. I cooked for her. I helped her settle. I gave space when needed. I tried to be the kind of mother-in-law people talk about with kindness. Change doesn't arrive loudly. It comes quietly, softly, like dust settling where you don't notice. Conversations became shorter. Meals were eaten separately. Doors closed more often. I blamed myself. Maybe I talk too much. Maybe I expect too much. Maybe I am old-fashioned. So I became quieter. I thought silence would fix things. One day, my son asked me for the house papers, just for record keeping, he said. I trusted him. Why wouldn't I? He was my son. I handed him the papers without a second thought. That night, something inside me felt uneasy, but I pushed the feeling away. Trust can blind even the strongest hearts. That was the day he asked me to sit down. The room felt heavy. The air felt thick. We sold the house, he said. For a moment, I didn't understand. Sold? What do you mean? I asked quietly. There were debts, he said. It was the best decision. My ears rang. My hands went cold. That house is my home, I whispered. He finally looked at me then. We'll manage, he said. But his voice didn't sound like we included me. You can stay somewhere else for a while, he added. Somewhere else. As if I was an old chair that no longer fit the room. I nodded. I don't remember standing up. I don't remember walking to my room. I only remember sitting on my bed, holding the edge of the mattress, trying to breathe. That night, I walked through every room. I touched the walls, the door frames, the kitchen counter where I spent decades cooking. I sat on the floor and cried silently. I didn't want anyone to hear, because even then, I didn't want to trouble them. I didn't ask why he didn't tell me earlier. I didn't ask why my name didn't matter. I didn't ask how a son could sell his mother's home. Some questions are too painful to speak aloud. The morning after my son sold the house, I woke up in a borrowed room, somewhere I had never imagined sleeping, somewhere that smelled faintly of someone else's life. The walls were painted a shade of beige I didn't recognize. The bed creaked under me in a way that reminded me that this was not my home. I sat there quietly. The air outside smelled of rain and soil, but the world felt distant, like it had moved on without me. I tried to remember why I had always believed my children would care for me. I tried to hold on to that trust, but every memory I recalled seemed to twist into a question. Had I been wrong all along? The first week was unbearable. Every morning, I reached for the phone, hoping for a message, hoping for a call. Even the smallest gesture would have meant the world, but no one called. No one asked if I had eaten. No one asked if I was warm. No one asked how I slept. I spent hours staring at the phone, my hand trembling over the keypad. Every time it rang, my heart jumped. But it was always a wrong number. Always a telemarketer. Always not them. I felt invisible, like I had ceased to exist. The room I stayed in was small. A bed, a chair, a wardrobe. Not much more. I had no memories. no history, no warmth. I unpacked a small bag, the only belongings I had brought from my home. A few clothes, a shawl, some old photographs, my husband's letters, memories in small packages. Every night, I held a photograph of the house. The house my son had sold. The house that held every laugh, every birthday, every tear I had shed raising him. And I whispered into the darkness, "How could you do this?" On the third day, I asked to see the house one last time. My son hesitated. I knew he was ashamed, or maybe afraid of facing me. When I arrived, everything felt wrong. The door was different. The paint was fresh. The garden was gone. Even the scent of the soil had changed. Inside, the walls were empty. The rooms were stripped of furniture. It looked clean, but it didn't feel like home. I walked slowly. Every step hurt. Every corner reminded me of something lost. The kitchen counter, once full of the warmth of meals and conversations, was bare. The living room where I had held my children in my arms was silent. The bedrooms, once filled with the cries of my little boy, were empty echoes. I touched the walls. Tears ran down my face. No one saw. No one cared. When I returned to the borrowed room, I tried to call him. Only once, twice, 3 times. No answer. Later he sent a message. "I'm busy. I will talk later." Don't worry. I worried anyway, more than ever. I tried to eat, but food tasted like dust in my mouth. I tried to sleep, but the mattress felt foreign, unkind. I was not just homeless. I was heartless in my own eyes, discarded, forgotten. People in the neighborhood where I stayed were kind. They smiled, they asked polite questions, but they had no memories with me, no shared history. I tried talking to them about my son, but they didn't understand. They didn't know the pain of watching a child push you aside after decades of love. I realized that grief is lonely. Even when surrounded by people, nights were the hardest. I lay awake, thinking of small things, the swing in the garden, the sound of my son calling, "Amy," from the front yard, the smell of fresh roti in the kitchen, the warmth of the living room on winter evenings, all gone, and every memory hurt more because my son had chosen to erase the house that contained them. My son claimed there were debts. That's why he sold the house. I tried to understand, to see it from his side. I visited the bank. I read the documents. I realized the house could have been saved. The debts could have been negotiated. But my son chose the quickest way. Not once did he think of me. Not once did he consider the home I had built. The home that held the years of my life. Day by day, the weight grew heavier. I started to doubt myself. Maybe I had been too controlling. Maybe I had been too trusting. Maybe I had failed as a mother. I talked to myself in whispers. I repeated old advice my father once gave me. People may forget what you said, but they will remember how you made them feel. But how could I reconcile that with the fact that my son could erase my life so completely? Every night, I stared at the ceiling. I imagined winters in this strange room. I imagined birthdays alone. I imagined sickness with no one to care for me. And the worst thought, what if my son didn't even think of me at all? One morning, I found a letter tucked into my bag. No sender name, no address. Inside, simple words. "I know it's hard, but you are strong. You will find your place. Don't give up." I didn't know who wrote it. I didn't know if it was real, but it gave me a small spark, a tiny ember of hope. Maybe, just maybe, I could survive this. Days passed in that borrowed room, each one blending into the next. The mornings were gray. The afternoons were silent. The nights were long, empty stretches of darkness that made my chest ache with a hollow emptiness. I realized something essential. I could not wait forever. I could not depend on a child who had already abandoned me. But what could I do? Where could I go? I had no house, no family willing to embrace me, no security. And yet, I refused to crumble completely. There was still a flicker of life inside me, no matter how faint. One morning, after a restless night, I sat by the window, staring at the street below. People passed by, laughing, rushing, living. And I asked myself, will I let this define the rest of my life? I realized that if I did not act, I would disappear slowly. Not just from my son's life, but from my own sense of self. That day, I made a decision. I would not let despair have the final word. I would reclaim some control, no matter how small. I began contacting old friends, neighbors I hadn't spoken to in years, cousins I had lost touch with. Some didn't respond. Some had passed away. Some lived too far away to help, but a few answered. Warm voices, concerned eyes, reminders that I was not entirely alone. One friend, Fatima, even invited me to stay at her small apartment temporarily. It was not my home. It was not perfect, but it was a start, a lifeline. I knew I could not stay in this limbo forever. I needed answers. I needed closure. I needed to face the one who had turned his back on me. I called my son. The first time, he didn't answer. The second time, the line went straight to voicemail. The third, he picked up, his voice cold and tired. "Amy, I'm busy," he said. "I will talk later." I swallowed my pride. I took a deep breath, and I spoke as calmly as I could manage. "Amir, I need to understand. Why did you sell the house? Why did you leave me with nowhere?" There was silence on the other end, then a sigh, then words I will never forget. "Amy, I didn't know what else to do. There were debts. There were bills. I thought it was the only way. I could have helped," I said softly. "I could have found a solution with you. But you didn't ask. You didn't tell me." He paused, and in that pause, I could hear the guilt buried deep in his chest. I'm sorry, Amy," he whispered, "but you have to understand. I was trying to protect you." "Protect me?" I asked, voice trembling. "By erasing the life I built? By taking away my home, my memories, my stability?" His silence said more than words ever could. After the call, I felt a mixture of sadness and clarity. I could no longer depend on my son to care for me. I could no longer wait for him to make a choice for my life. I needed to stand on my own. I began to research housing options, senior centers, and small apartments that I could afford. It was exhausting. It was frightening. But every application I filled, every call I made, was a tiny act of reclaiming my dignity. For the first time in weeks, I felt a small spark of empowerment. Not happiness, not yet, but hope. One afternoon, while sorting through my belongings, I found an old letter from my late husband, Rahim. He had written it many years ago, long before the house was sold. "Salma, remember, no matter what happens, you are strong. Your love and wisdom are yours to keep. The world may not always understand, but you must never forget who you are." I clutched the letter to my chest. Tears streamed down my face, but this time, they were not only tears of loss. They were tears of strength returning, of a reminder that I had survived so much already. Fatima helped me find a small, cozy apartment. It was modest. The walls were plain, but the windows opened to sunlight, and I could breathe freely. Neighbors welcomed me warmly. Some offered help with groceries. Some invited me for tea. Little by little, I began to feel alive again. I started walking in the mornings. I talked to people in the park. I laughed quietly to myself sometimes, remembering Rahim's jokes. The world had not ended. It had shifted, and I was learning to move with it. Weeks later, my son appeared at my new apartment. His eyes were filled with a mixture of shame and worry. I wanted to check on you, Amy," he said, voice low. I looked at him. I had so many questions, so much anger, so much hurt, but I also realized that holding on to anger would trap me in the past. I took a deep breath, and I said, calmly, "Amir, you hurt me, but I am alive. I am surviving, and I am learning to live again." His eyes filled with tears. He knelt and held my hand. "I am so sorry, Amy. I never meant to." I stopped him gently. "I know, but the past cannot be undone. The only thing we can do is move forward." That moment was the turning point. Not because everything was fixed, not because my son had magically become perfect, but because I realized something essential. I am my own anchor. I am my own shelter. I do not need anyone's permission to live with dignity. The pain was still there. The scars were real, but I felt a strength I hadn't felt in decades. I could live again. I could find joy in simple things. I could rebuild a life that belonged to me. I began writing letters to old friends. I started cooking small meals for myself. I listened to music I had loved in my youth. I even started a small garden by the window, planting flowers that reminded me of my husband's favorite blooms. Every day, I felt a little stronger. Every day, I reminded myself that life is unpredictable, but I still have the power to choose my path. And slowly, just slowly, I began to let go of the hurt that had held me captive. The days in my new apartment began to pass differently. The air felt lighter, even if my heart was still heavy. The walls, plain and bare, slowly started to feel like a space I could call my own. I realized something I had long forgotten. A home is more than walls and roofs. It's a place where your heart can breathe again. A tea first. Every task felt like a mountain. Cooking for one, cleaning for one, walking alone in the park, it was all new. I would stand in the kitchen staring at a pot, unsure if I should even make lunch. But little by little, I remembered the rhythms of life. I chopped vegetables with care, stirring them slowly, as if pouring love back into the air. I set the table for myself, arranging utensils neatly, and sipped tea while watching sunlight drift across the floor. These routines became my anchor. They reminded me I was still alive, that I still mattered. Even if my son had betrayed me, one afternoon, I found a stray cat near the park entrance. Its fur was matted, its eyes wary. I knelt and offered a piece of bread. To my surprise, it came closer, brushing against my hand. I smiled for the first time in weeks, feeling warmth bloom inside me. I named her Chanda. She followed me home that day and slept curled at the edge of my bed. Her quiet presence became a comforting reminder. Life moves forward, even after loss. I began visiting the park daily. I would bring a book, watch the birds, and listen to children laugh in the distance. Their laughter was bittersweet. It reminded me of a yawn, but it also reminded me that the world still held life, still held beauty. Fatima and a few old friends became my lifeline. They visited, brought meals, shared stories, and helped me navigate this new chapter. With their encouragement, I started reconnecting with distant relatives. Some visits were awkward, some were full of warmth, but each connection reminded me that I was not truly alone. I also began volunteering at a local community center, helping other elderly people who felt abandoned, teaching them to write letters, sharing my small wisdom, cooking small meals. It brought meaning back into my days. I realized something profound: giving love, even without expecting anything in return, heals the heart. The memories of the house my son sold haunted me. The rooms where I had laughed, cried, and celebrated birthdays, they no longer existed for me in the physical sense. But I realized they still lived in my heart. I could remember every corner, every window, every sound of the floorboards under my feet. I would recall these moments, not to mourn endlessly, but to honor them as part of my life story. One day, I walked past the street where my house had once stood. I paused, feeling a knot of grief tighten in my chest. The house was gone, replaced by a new building. I closed my eyes, imagining Rahim standing by the doorway, smiling at me. And for the first time in a long time, I smiled back. I whispered softly, "I am still here. I am still living. I am still loving." Amir called one evening. His voice was hesitant. I wanted to see how you are, Ami," he said. I listened carefully. I felt the old hurt bubble up, but I also felt something new, calm. I realized that forgiveness is not about condoning the pain others caused. It's about freeing yourself from carrying it endlessly. "Amir," I said gently, "I am surviving. I am living. That is what matters." He stayed silent, then whispered, "I'm sorry, Ami." I nodded. The apology was enough for him. Not for me, entirely, but it was enough for me to release some of the weight I had been carrying. Life in the apartment continued slowly but steadily. I grew fond of small routines. Morning walks became meditative moments. Cooking became therapy. Chanda curled at my feet while I read books I had long ignored. I even planted flowers by the windowsill, marigolds and roses, the colors bright against the plain walls. Every bloom reminded me that life, like these flowers, grows and blossoms even after being uprooted. The days were not perfect. Sometimes the phone didn't ring. Sometimes the nights felt unbearably quiet. But I began to understand a profound truth. Happiness is not a constant state. It is in moments, fleeting and small, but powerful enough to keep the heart alive. I began to write again. Letters to Ayan, letters to Amir, letters to Rahim. I poured memories into these letters, birthdays, small jokes, lessons about life. I never sent some of them. Some I placed in a box, preserving them as a testament to a life lived fully. Even with betrayal, writing became a form of therapy. Each letter, each memory, each sentence reminded me that my story mattered. That even if my son had sold my house, he could never take away my memories, my wisdom, or my dignity. One rainy afternoon, I wrote a letter not to anyone else, but to myself. "Salma, you have endured betrayal, loss, and abandonment. You have wept alone. You have mourned homes lost, and you have faced the absence of love where it should have been constant. But look at yourself now. You are alive. You are breathing. You are learning to love again, even in small ways. You have not given up. You have survived. And that is more than enough. This life is yours to shape, and no one can take that away. Keep walking, keep growing, keep loving yourself. I folded the letter and placed it in a small wooden box with Raheem's old watch and a few photographs. It was my personal treasure, a reminder that I could face the world with courage and grace. The turning point of this chapter was not just survival. It was discovery. I discovered resilience. I discovered inner strength. I discovered the ability to love life, even when it had hurt me deeply. I began mentoring younger women in my community. I shared my experiences not to complain, not to dwell, but to guide them through challenges of family, betrayal, and self-worth. They listened. They learned. And in teaching, I found purpose again. Months passed. I visited the park daily. I cooked for myself and occasionally for friends. I celebrated small achievements, a flower blooming, a letter sent, a warm conversation with a neighbor. My life had changed dramatically from the day my son sold my house. But the change was not entirely negative. It had forced me to look inward, to rely on myself, to rebuild. I understood finally. Home is not just a building. Home is safety, love, and dignity. And I had rebuilt mine not in walls, but in spirit. I sometimes still think of a mirror, of a yawn, of the house that no longer exists. The pain is there, but it no longer controls me. I have created a life that I can own fully. A life where I am not waiting for calls, where I am not dependent on others for happiness, where I can live fully, intentionally, and with love for myself. And that, perhaps, is the greatest victory of all. The first morning I woke up fully alone in my new apartment. I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years: peace. The air was still and soft. Sunlight streamed through the half-open window, catching dust motes that floated lazily like tiny stars. Chanda stretched on the windowsill, her purrs vibrating softly against the silence. For a moment, I simply sat on the edge of my bed, breathing in the quiet. There was no shouting, no tension, no feeling of being watched or judged, just a world that existed for me alone. I felt the strange, bittersweet relief of being unwanted by my son and yet being free to reclaim my life on my own terms. I started small. Breakfast became a ritual rather than a duty. I boiled eggs, toasted bread, and poured tea into my favorite cup. Each sip felt like a small victory. I no longer worried whether someone would approve or criticize. This life, my life, was mine to nurture. Chanda followed me everywhere. Her small, soft presence reminded me that companionship didn't need to come only from my children. Love, even in its simplest form, could still exist. I decided to explore the city. Streets I had avoided for years became new worlds. Small parks, bustling markets, quiet bookstores. I began walking without urgency, without obligation. I discovered cafes with the smell of fresh bread, benches overlooking fountains, and the subtle joy of observing life as it moved around me. Each day brought a sense of independence I hadn't realized I had lost. Every step was a declaration. I am here. I exist, and my life has value. Even without my son's approval or presence, I began to revisit the memories of my old home, not with grief alone, but with gratitude for the life I had lived. I took out the small wooden box I had packed months ago: letters, photographs, Raheem's watch, tiny keepsakes from a yawn. I handled each item carefully, remembering birthdays celebrated, quiet evenings spent with Amir, and laughter that once filled rooms. Some memories stung, sharp and raw. The betrayal of my son, the cold indifference, the house sold without notice, all of it still hurt. But the pain no longer felt like chains around my heart. It was a reminder of endurance, of resilience, of a life survived with dignity. I began writing my story, not for anyone else, but for myself. Every morning, I poured my thoughts onto paper: the grief, the loneliness, the moments of betrayal, but also the small joys, the lessons learned, and the strength I had found in solitude. Through writing, I realized something essential: telling your story is part of reclaiming it. Each word was a step toward healing, a testament to survival, a declaration that my life mattered. Fatima and a few old friends became my lifeline. We cooked together, shared stories, and supported each other through lonely days. One evening, as we sat sipping tea, I realized how much warmth human connection brings even when it doesn't come from your own children. I also began volunteering at a local community center, helping other elderly women who had been abandoned, teaching simple skills, sharing meals, and offering companionship. It all gave me purpose. Their gratitude, their smiles, reminded me that life can still be meaningful, even when family fails you. Through these connections, I learned that family is not only the people related to you by blood. Family can be chosen, nurtured, and built through love, trust, and shared experiences. Weeks turned into months. Sometimes I would hear my phone ring, and my heart would jump, hoping it might be Amir or Ayan, but it rarely was. Mostly, it was community members, neighbors, or old friends. The first time my son actually called, I froze. "Amy," he said softly, hesitantly. I wanted to see how you are." I took a deep breath. The anger, sadness, and betrayal all rose in my chest, but I didn't answer with words of accusation. I simply said, "I am alive. That is what matters." He apologized, but I realized forgiveness wasn't about letting him off the hook. It was about freeing myself from the weight of resentment. I felt lighter somehow, stronger. My life no longer revolved around waiting for his approval or love. I had built something far more important: self-respect, independence, and inner peace. Each day became a canvas of small victories. I grew flowers by the windowsill, marigolds and roses that reminded me that life, like these blossoms, could flourish even after being uprooted. I cooked meals just for myself, experimenting with recipes I had never tried. The aroma of spices, the careful preparation of food, it became a meditation, a way to honor the woman I had become. Evenings were spent reading or sitting with Chanda. Sometimes I wrote letters I would never send, capturing my thoughts and emotions so that they could exist without judgment or interference. I began to travel lightly, exploring nearby towns and parks, carrying nothing but curiosity and a small bag. I discovered beauty in solitude and a sense of freedom that I had long forgotten. The most important lesson I learned was dignity. I had been betrayed, abandoned, and left with nowhere to go, but I had not lost myself. My spirit, my mind, and my heart were still intact. I realized that being abandoned by someone who should have loved me did not define my worth. My worth was inherent, independent of their actions. This realization transformed the way I walked, the way I spoke, and the way I lived. I carried myself with quiet strength, no longer shrinking in the shadows of betrayal. I often think about Amir and Ayan. I miss them. I love them. But I also accept the reality of their choices. Love is complicated. Sometimes it is unreturned. Sometimes it is twisted by selfishness or fear. But love, even when unreciprocated, has the power to teach resilience, patience, and compassion. I learned to love without expectation. I learned to find joy in my own company, and in the company of those who truly value me. Months turned into a year. I celebrated my birthday quietly, surrounded by friends and the gentle presence of Chanda. I visited the park every morning, greeted neighbors with a smile, and found contentment in the simplicity of life. I understood that happiness does not come from wealth, property, or even children's affection. It comes from self-respect, purpose, and the ability to find beauty in each moment. I no longer waited by the phone. I no longer counted days or longed for calls that might never come. I lived for myself. One evening, as the sun set over the city, I sat by the window with a cup of tea. I whispered to myself softly, firmly, "Salma, you have been hurt. You have been betrayed. But you have survived. You have rebuilt. You have created a life of dignity, independence, and love. No one can take that away. You are whole. You are enough. You are free." And in that moment, I realized freedom is not a place. Freedom is not a child's affection, a home, or a family's approval. Freedom is knowing your own heart, embracing your own worth, and living a life that belongs to you alone.